Hello and welcome to The Interview. I'm pleased to welcome one of the world's most high-profile human rights campaigners. Kenneth Roth is the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, the international non-governmental organization. Since joining HRW in 1993, he has investigated rights abuses around the globe. Prior to that, he served as a federal prosecutor in New York and for the Iran-Contra investigation in Washington, D.C. Thank you for being here on the program.
Thanks for having me, Armel.
First of all, on the situation in Turkey, obviously the big moving news story of this week. What information do you have, given your organization's presence on the ground, about the current state of the crackdown?
Well, the good news is that the coup failed. The bad news is that Erdogan is profiting from this coup attempt to shut down the opposition, as far as we can tell. And this seems to be an effort to simply wipe out people by virtue of their association with this movement, rather than any evidence that they had anything whatsoever to do with the coup attempt.
Human Rights Watch, like other organizations, and indeed like certain governments, have condemned this purge, but those criticisms haven't made any difference, have they?
Well, so far, Erdogan seems to feel that he's got momentum on his side. You know, he ended the coup, and certainly the vast majority of the Turkish people wanted the coup defeated, and he now is profiting from that. So I think that it is important for Western governments to make clear, as many of them have been doing, that the preservation of democracy is the goal, not the preservation of a particular man's imperial visions for his presidency. And that, yes, the defeat of the coup is a victory for democracy, but that victory will be lost if the result is that critical journalists, critical academics, critical judges, any independent body from Erdogan is suddenly suppressed.
Is there any kind of pressure that you can imagine working?
Well, I think that Erdogan does, frankly, care about his relations with the West. If you look at the migration deal that he negotiated with primarily Angela Merkel, he wants free visa access for Turks to Europe. He ultimately wants EU membership. Needless to say, this utter crackdown is antithetical to EU values and puts Turkey in the opposite direction. It's important for European Union representatives and national governments in Europe to make that 100% clear.
You've done obviously a lot of work on the refugee crisis, and particularly the refugees from Syria, using Turkey as a sort of a launching pad to come into the European Union. How do you think all that is going to be affected by this turmoil in Turkey?
Well, you know, the difficulty with the deal that the European Union struck with Turkey is that the plan to send Syrian refugees and other refugees back to Turkey was premised on Turkey being a safe place where they could then seek asylum from. Turkey is looking less and less safe. I mean, not only do we have instances of persecution of particularly Iraqi and Afghan refugees, we have a new war against the Kurds, and now suddenly we're getting a number of secular and other dissidents within the Turkish mainstream who suddenly may be seeking asylum in Europe. So this is hardly looking safe at all, and that intellectual premise of the entire deal is quickly being undermined.
So Turkey not looking safe for refugees. Clearly, they haven't become more safe in Syria either, overall. What do you think is the way forward there? I know that you've tried to put pressure not just on the Syrian government, but also on the Russians as well, who've been supporting Assad. How's that working out?
Well, first of all, I think it's important for people to understand that what makes the Syrian war unusual, the reason it has produced 4 million plus refugees, is that Assad has chosen to fight this war not just by targeting combatants on the other side, which is the way you're supposed to do it under the Geneva Conventions, but rather by deliberately attacking civilians who happen to live in opposition-held areas. That is a blatant war crime, and frankly, that wouldn't be possible had Putin not come in and rescued Assad and permitted him militarily to continue that war crime strategy. Now, Assad is beyond shaming, but Putin is not. Putin wants things, particularly from Europe. He wants the Ukraine sanctions lifted. He wants various economic benefits from Europe. So he is sensitive to European public opinion. European leaders should make clear that Putin is not a partner in peace the way John Kerry presents him, but rather an accomplice in mass murder until he stops Assad from targeting the Syrian people.
But of course, making representations to Putin, that doesn't really seem to have borne much fruit.
Well, my plan is not to just quietly present things to Putin. I think what matters is the way Putin and his Russia is portrayed in Europe. because he cares about European public opinion. So when Assad barrel bombs 5 hospitals, as occurred this past weekend in Aleppo, people should be asking Putin, why are you letting him do this? You have the capacity to stop this slaughter of civilians, these attacks on civilian institutions. Why do you facilitate it through your military commitment? If that is a message that is routinely spread in Europe, Putin will be responsive.
But there should also then be pressure on, for example, Gulf Arab states that are prolonging this war by militarily supporting proxies in Syria. Isn't that a big failing at the moment in Western policy?
Well, clearly there are abuses on all sides. And on the anti-Assad side, it's foremost the Islamic State or the Daesh that has been responsible for these horrible atrocities that we've seen. But frankly, also Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate, and other members of the opposition that are supported by the Gulf.
And also members of the rebels that, for example, Washington calls moderate rebels. But
Precisely.
you have also catalogued certain abuses committed by them, have you not?
Yes, Human Rights Watch has definitely documented abuses by all sides. But it's important to recognize that if you just total things up, the best estimate that I've seen is that of the civilian deaths attributable to any side, 80% are the result of the Assad government and his deliberate efforts to target civilians. So we should clearly put pressure on all sides and use the Gulf states to try to put pressure on the rebel force that they are supporting. But the key to ending this massive slaughter, this huge refugee flow, is stopping Assad from targeting civilians. And the route to doing that lies through the Kremlin.
Kenneth Roth, I would like to ask you about how you gather evidence, because I think this is something that people, a generalist audience, might not know. I want to quote a statement from your founder, Robert Bernstein. Now, I know there's a whole history between HRW and Robert Bernstein. We can't get into that. But he said a few years ago, Human Rights Watch relies on witnesses whose stories cannot be verified and who may testify for political advantage or because they fear retaliations from their own rulers. That does sound like a very credible problem when you look at Syria, which is such a complex situation politically.
Well, first of all, it's important to recognize that Human Rights Watch collects information by having people on the ground at the site of atrocities, interviewing eyewitnesses, interviewing victims. Now, in a war situation, people do have an incentive to lie. You've got to accept that. And so we will not report something until we've been able to corroborate it. That means getting multiple witnesses to the same event. It means cross-examining them, cross-checking what they say. And only when we're convinced that something happened will we report it. You can't just routinely, pretend you're going to write down whatever somebody says to you, because you'll get it wrong. You will, let them use you as a source to get their partisan views out. But you can, if you're skeptical, if you're objective, get to the bottom of what happens, and that's what Human Rights Watch does through our researchers on the ground. So
you have a bar that you apply in terms of how many witnesses have to be corroborated and so on.
Well, we don't have strict numbers, but the bottom line is we're not there to simply be scribes for what people tell us. We're there to report the truth. And we will push and cross-examine and double-check and corroborate until we're convinced that something happened, and only then will we report it.
Another example of where that kind of reporting has been questioned, and obviously it's a very sensitive topic, the child sex abuse scandal in the Central African Republic involving foreign peacekeepers, including French peacekeepers, but not only the French. There have been occasional suggestions that perhaps some of the witnesses were trying to get financial gain for their impoverished families. Is that a possibility, do you think?
Well, Human Rights Watch doesn't pay witnesses, so they don't get anything from talking to us. But again, in a situation like that, of course people have an incentive to lie, which is why we will not report an allegation until we've been able to corroborate it. And I can say with absolute assurance that there have been many instances of sexual abuse by various peacekeepers in the Central African Republic. So I think the issue is not, did it happen? But rather, what are the steps that various contributing governments and the United Nations or the African Union, what steps are they taking to ensure that these abuses don't take place by the supposed peacekeepers, and that those who do commit abuses of this sort are brought to justice?
We've been talking about largely authoritarian governments in this interview. What about a democracy like France, which has just extended its state of emergency? Is there any parallel that can be drawn with Turkey? I know in one of your dispatches on your website, it does mention France and Turkey in the same paragraph.
Yeah. Well, Erdogan is citing France's state of emergency to justify his own. They're very different, and I can get to that in a moment. But let's start with France, because while France does face a serious terrorism threat, and the Nice attack was just the most recent example of that, it's far from clear that the extension of the state of emergency was the least bit necessary. Why can't the police go to a judge before arresting somebody or searching their home or looking at their computer? Nobody's really made that case. And I fear that the state of emergency was much more a political response, an effort by politicians to say, look, we take this security threat seriously. But if the consequence of that is to make it easier for the police to discriminate against minority or Muslim communities, you're actually going to make the security threat more severe rather than addressing the root causes, which the state of emergency is a bit of a distraction from, because we should be focusing on what will it take to really include various communities that so far feel excluded from mainstream French society.
I suppose the problem that you face at Human Rights Watch and probably other organizations is that the media narrative seems to be controlled by those who want a more, a heavy security response, and perhaps it's difficult to make that kind of case that you've just been mentioning in the media.
Well, I think the important thing is to stress the difference between a heavy-handed response and an effective response. I mean, yes, you've got to take the terrorist threat seriously, but if the tools you use facilitate the kind of discrimination and exclusion that actually makes some alienated individuals resort to violence, you're actually making things worse rather than better. So being tough can be more ineffective.
I understand. Just one final question for you. The UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, is stepping down at the end of this year. In the light of these global hotspots and conflicts we've been talking about, what qualities do you think the next UN Secretary General must have?
Well, we need somebody who is willing to be principled about standing up for human rights, even when the violator of human rights is either a permanent member of the Security Council or one of its close friends. And to just give a contrary example, I mean, Ban Ki-moon had this so-called list of shame, where governments that systematically violated the rights of children in conflict situations were listed. But in the last 2 years, he first took Israel off that list because of pressure from the United States. Then he took Saudi Arabia off that list over its abuses in Yemen because they threatened economic retaliation. What we need in a new Secretary General is somebody who will say no to that kind of pressure and will uphold human rights, whoever the violator is.
We'll have to end it there. Thank you very much, Kenneth Roth, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. And that's all we have time for on The Interview. More news coming up soon.